very exciting to have the level of participation that we have tonight, with the experience that is here tonight to share with you, and the commitment that our participants have in addressing this very critical issue. Now, before we get started with the program, just some very quick announcements. One, we just want to make sure everyone is aware that tonight's forum is going to be videotaped so that we'll be able to look over the information and make sure we can collect data about the information that's shared during tonight's program. Also, we want to acknowledge the people who helped us put tonight's program together. First of all, we'd like to acknowledge Harford Community College for hosting the program tonight. And in particular, we have to thank Ms. Carol Love. I'm sorry. And we also want to acknowledge the leaders of Together We Will, Ms. Delane Lewis, the Forum Planning Committee who planned tonight's program, Sharon Delgado, if you raise your hand, Maureen Delane Lewis, Chelsea Roberts, and Betty Willard. And we couldn't have our program tonight if it weren't for volunteers giving up their time. Mr. Lewis Barnett, Chelsea Roberts, Jean Smith, Sandra Tracy, Christian Walker, and Betty Willard. My name is Chris Providence. I am the co-facilitator of Together We Will's Racial Justice Action Group. And it is a real pleasure to be here this evening. Now, we're here to talk about the school-to-prison pipeline. And we thank you all for showing your interest in this very critical subject by being here tonight. The school-to-prison pipeline is a disturbing national trend in which school policies tend to funnel children out of public schools and into the juvenile and criminal justice systems. Now, here's a quote I want you to think about. About 70% of offenders and ex-offenders are high school dropouts. And according to at least one study, about half are functionally illiterate. Many offenders are tracked for prison at early ages, as early as 3rd grade, labeled as criminals in their teen years, and then shuttled from their underfunded schools to brand new high-tech prisons, many privately owned. The communities and schools from which they come have failed to prepare them for the workforce, and once they have been labeled criminals, their job prospects and their futures are forever bleak. That comes from Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. If you haven't read this book, please put it at the top of your must-read list. Mm-hmm. We know that statistics show that children of color and children from poor communities are disproportionately targeted for the school-to-prison pipeline. So why are we here tonight? Because tonight we want to talk about solutions. We want to talk about what we can do as a community to disrupt the school-to-prison pipeline. Now, tonight's forum is the second in a series. On October the 17th, we held a forum here on the school-to-prison pipeline focusing on restorative practices. So tonight, we continue that discussion because we know this is a complex problem that's not going to be solved in one night. So we plan for this to be an ongoing series addressing this problem. So tonight, we're here to share information about what we as a community can do to keep children out of the juvenile and criminal justice systems. So we hope everyone who leaves tonight will be armed with knowledge. knowledge that will help you chip away at that stone mountain, that stone wall, and the mountain. Because when you look at it as a whole, sometimes it seems like it's impossible to tear down, but the more you chip away, the easier it is to tear down. So tonight we've been very, very blessed to have some experts and some committed individuals who are here to share information and experiences with you to help you learn what you can do to tear down that wall. On the panel, we have Mr. Kendall Lane. Mr. Kendall Lane is the coordinator of the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative in the Office of Equity and Reform in the Maryland Department of Juvenile Services. And we're also awaiting Ms. Robin McNair, licensed restorative practices trainer and coach. We have Dr. H. Lovell Smith, professor of sociology at Loyola University. And we have Dr. Lisa Williams, executive director of the Office of Equity and Cultural Proficiency, Baltimore County Public Schools. Also with us tonight, we have Mr. Matthew Fonseca, Regional Director, Maryland Department of Juvenile Services. And Ms. Betsy Tolentino is on her, or is here, thank you. Ms. Betsy Tolentino, Executive Director for Intake Pre-Adjudication. I knew I was going to have trouble saying that. I practiced on Pre-Adjudication and Social Reform, Maryland Department of Juvenile Services. Mr. Oshun Ogunranti, also the Maryland Department of Juvenile Services. Our facilitators this evening, who will be facilitating our small group discussions, are Ms. Rachel Ashbrook, educator and advocate. Ms. McNair, welcome. Perfect time. Mr. Ryan Burby, president, Harford County Education Association. Sharon Delgado, retired educator, Baltimore County Public Schools. And Mr. James J. Fulton Jr., assistant principal, Edgewood Middle School, Harford County Public Schools. Also, we're very fortunate to have with us tonight several members of the Harford County Public Schools Board of Education. Mr. Alfred Williamson is with us tonight. Mrs. Nancy Reynolds. President, Mr. Joseph Foshpool. And the student representative, Mr. Matt Resnick. Again, thank you all for being here tonight. After the panel discussion, we will have 20 minutes of questions. After that, we will split into 3 small group discussions.
Good evening, everyone. All right, so my name is Kendall Lane with the Department of Juvenile Services, JDAI coordinator. And the question that was presented to me was how do we keep our youth out of the juvenile justice system or the legal system? And a few things that came to my mind is that we have to do this as a collective approach. Various stakeholders, we have to get everyone involved, the communities, the schools, the legal systems, law enforcement, everyone, because we all have a stake in this situation. So basically, we want to continue to empower those communities. And how do we do that? A couple ways. We want to do that while doing that, we also want to make sure that we're not criminalizing youthful behaviors. And what do I mean by that? For example, school situation, students get into a fight. and the school will probably sanction one way or the other. They'll probably say detention, suspension, maybe expulsion. At the same time, those referrals will still come to DJS for legal action. So we're saying solve those issues at the school level and leave the legal system out for those types of situations. We also want to make sure that we're doing diversion correctly and we're diverting the right way, because if we're doing that, then those cases would never make it to the legal system. And by that, we're empowering the schools to divert cases. We're empowering the local law enforcement to divert those cases as well. And all these things are important, not only just for youth of all youth, but also youth of color, because their contact with the juvenile justice system is increasingly higher than those of other youth. And so while doing that, we also want to raise awareness for those types of resources, because I know in Baltimore City we have a resource fair, and some community members may not know what is in their community or how to access these resources, whether it's counseling, whether it's mentoring services, or services of those natures. So we want to make sure that we increase the awareness, help those young people in those families, and make sure that we create an outlet for services. We don't want to wait until they have contact with us, and then all of a sudden, they're asking us for services and for help. We want to make sure that we address that from the very beginning, because if we do that, then we get to the root causes of the issues, and we'll be able to solve the issues or the behaviors that may lead to delinquency. Once we address those things, then I'm quite sure that we'll be making a huge difference in my mind. And so some of the diversion programs that we have in Baltimore City, we have a teen court, and then we also have community conferencing, both for restorative justice practice modules. Basically, the teen court emphasizes accountability for the youth. At the same time, they're being judged by a jury of the youth. Of course, there's an adult judge, and basically there's going to be sanctions. Whatever that has made the referral there, they're going to talk about the case, and then there's going to come a discussion about what type of remedy is going to take place. And so it gives kind of that restorative justice approach that lets the community and lets everyone weigh in, everyone can talk about what happened, and so we can come up with a collective agreement to hopefully resolve the issue. And then we also have the community conferencing, which is a conflict resolution program. During this, you have dialogue circles where they would come in and they would exchange between the victim and also the offender. And basically during these times, it's a chance for a conversation. It also gives an opportunity to discuss what the harm was done. It also allows for effective communication and also any repairs that need to be done between the victim and also the offender as well. So it's saying that these are all these things that we could focus on to help change the trajectory that we have with our young people, and to just focus on getting it right on the front end. Because as soon as we get it right on the front end, then we'll be able to, it'll make it easier to fight easier on the deeper end. So we definitely want to focus on diversion, focus on having outlets in the communities for our young people to go to, and so that we can address the issue before it becomes an even bigger issue. And so with that, I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lane. Just as a reminder, since we will be collecting questions after each panelist has spoken, Ms. McNair?
Thank you. I first want to apologize for being late today. I stayed over on my job a little bit later because I have some other things taking place over the weekend.
We're just glad you're here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I definitely want to, echo my colleague when he talks about it starts in school. And first and foremost, I consider myself an educator, and I was born an educator. I'm going to die an educator. So I have a question for you. How would you like your child to be in my classroom? And I have a gun strapped to my waist.
No.
How would you like to be a visitor in my classroom, and you're a little upset about my grading policies, or maybe the way I graded your child's paper, and I'm sitting down with you in a conference and I have a gun strapped to my waist. And that is a solution that some people are trying to respond in terms of that unfortunate event that took place a month ago. So, just like Mr. Lane said, it really starts in the schools when you think about juveniles. Because the word juvenile basically means someone under 18.
Yeah.
It basically means a child. And what we've done in this society, because we have become a prison complex society, is we have started taking the problem of institutional racism and putting it upon our children in the form of criminalizing our youth. And we look at our African American males and our wonderful brown Latinx males, and we see them as being so much older than they are. So immediately they pose a threat to us. In order for us in the schools to take responsibility for making sure our young people heal and learn and develop those social and emotional skills that they need to be able to resolve conflict so they won't resort to violence, we need to make sure our educators are trained. And that training, of course, involves restorative practices. But not just telling teachers, okay, do this, this, and this. It's about really helping teachers to acknowledge their own personal biases and to really be able to see these young people as not someone who's being violent, but as someone who doesn't know how to express their feelings because they may not have learned it in high school. They may not have learned it at home. So they come to school and they express their emotions the only way they know how. And it could be by acting out. So if educators are trained properly to be able to recognize those triggers and understand that this particular child is coming from a home that has violence in it, that means that when the educator responds to that child will, of course, will stay in a calm manner, and you don't have to worry about the child acting out what he sees in his neighborhood or at home. I also wrote down when you think about the school-to-prison pipeline, and you think about what causes the school-to-prison pipeline, policies and practices. It is so important for us as parents, communities, any type of educational stakeholders. You need to know your school system's policies. And if the policies are harsh, or if you realize the data does not match the policies, whereas 2 students, one white, one black or Latinx, LGBTQ, or child with a disability, is getting a harsher punishment or not getting the same punishment, and I hate to use that word punishment, the same accountability technique for doing the exact same action, then it's time to step up and say something. Because as long as we remain quiet, as long as we remain silent and allow it to continue to go on, because guess what? It's not my child. I don't have any children in public schools, but guess what? You're a citizen in the public. So these children do belong to you. If we stay silent and don't start speaking up, whether we're speaking up at the ballots or whether we are speaking up in the schools and challenging the lawmakers, the people who write discipline policies, then it's going to stay the same. So my advice would be, how do we keep students out of the school-to-prison pipeline? We need to make sure we are visible, make sure our teachers are getting the resources and training that they need. So first of all, they can feel like they're equipped and have self-efficacy to be able to educate these young people. And to make sure we are voting for those people who make laws, because guess what? They're not educators. So those people are making laws based on what they think should go on in the classroom. And where do they get that from? Most times, the media. So that would be my recommendation. And I do have handouts for everyone about how they are, when they privatize the prisons, guess what? We need to make sure we fill them up. How do we do that? Let's start with our youth.
Yes.
And then I also have something that you, the community and stakeholders, can do to be able to tackle the school-to-prison pipeline. That's it.
Thank you.
I should add that Ms. McNair was part of the panel in October on preventing the school-to-prison pipeline and the focus on restorative practices. And as you can see, she is phenomenal, so we just had to beg that she come back again tonight. So glad she did. Thank you. Hey, Dr. Smith.
How are you doing today? What I'd like to do is I'd like to bring each of us up front in this discussion around perhaps our tacit involvement in the creation of this pipeline. Because we've talked about policies and practices that create barriers, that identify certain students as problematic. But what we haven't talked about is how that sits in the DNA of our culture, how that sits in the DNA for all of us. So let me ask you this question while we're asking questions. How many of you feel that school safety is like one of our top 5 issues to be addressed? Okay. Let me ask you another question. For those of you who are homeowners, when you bought your home, where did the quality of the local public school factor in? Would you say that was like a top 2, 3 issue? Okay, so I'm going to make a guess. You were looking at the quality of the local school because schools are not equally resourced. You were looking at the local school because the demographics of those schools may or may not fit your preference. That is to say, when we talk about policies and practices that get created, that create barriers for certain students, we absolve ourselves of responsibility for our contribution in that. So, let's go back to this. In 1958, I did a little homework. I've been on this thing for the last couple of weeks around school resource officers. In 1958, Flint, Michigan, a high school in Flint, Michigan, placed the first school resource officer in. And very slowly, over the next 30 years, more and more schools saw the placement of a school resource officer as critically important for sort of smooth operation of the school day. So that by 1993, we have a national organization, a National Association of School Resource Officers. Now, what this has put in place is an advocacy organization for the further placement of school resource officers. So now let me bring you back into this. The expansion of school resource officers has happened almost in direct correlation with massive school shootings. But placing more and more school resource officers in the schools, and let's be very clear, school resource officers have a broad range of responsibilities, or I'm sorry, roles that they take on. Some of it is mentoring, some of it is in the classroom, they're working with students, some of it is counseling, but more importantly, should the resource officer be called upon for identified misbehavior, that school resource officer's presence creates a fact, as you were saying, down to adjudication. So, is every student equally likely to be identified as a problem? And the answer is no. Because in our DNA, we're going to over-police those schools that are primarily black and brown. So I've done a little homework here for Harford County. So Harford County has 10 high schools. And the most recent school arrest data released by the Maryland State Department of Education was in 2015. So 5 high schools in Harford County accounted for 85% of school arrests.
Which ones?
Oh,
we know. We know.
Oh, okay. So
I didn't mean that.
Okay.
We can name them.
Do you want me to name them, or do you want to name them?
them.
But the fact that you really are confident that you can name them speaks to how we have organized our resources in our community so that certain students are tracked to under-resourced schools and others to over-resourced schools, and therefore when you get ready to buy your home, you're going to find a good one rather than arguing for equitable and equal resourcing and quality of teaching that all students could have, because there's a direct and indirect pipeline to prison. The indirect pipeline is under-preparing a student to achieve. Students, and I know we've had this national issue under Bush about, students should be able to read by 3. But let me offer you this. By the 3rd grade, if the student is reading by the 3rd grade, they're going to be a challenge to get out of high school. I'm just sort of making that up. because the reality is this: many students in our schools are reading in kindergarten. They're reading in the first grade, but it's only the students in those schools that are primarily high farm schools, and where black and brown students go. So let me give you the 5 schools here. So Edgewood High School had 23 arrests, Joppatown 17, C. Middleton Wright 11, North Harford 12, and Harvard Grace 14.
Wait a minute.
He said, wait a minute.
I mean, there's a couple schools I wouldn't have never put on there.
Yeah, but we got to look at the statistics. She said there are a couple of schools, and I get what you're saying. The schools that you wouldn't put on there, let me guess, these would be, you wouldn't put North Harford on there because it's 90% white.
Right.
And I guess you also would put on there C. Milton Wright High School on there because it's 80% white.
Right.
So let's get back to the DNA. You expected the problem to be in the black schools, which, given the most recent shooting in Florida, the soft spot that gets created in all of us is a willingness to say that it is okay to over-police those schools where we expect crime to be, rather than where were you when the school board was arguing for resourcing those schools? And, you know, aren't we fighting and advocating for those children like everybody else? Instead of finding a house where the living is easier than cotton is high, if I can really borrow a really old metaphor. We got to do some soul searching, all of them. Because these policies and these practices get created in a climate of acceptance. And in that climate of acceptance, I know I'm going over, so I'm going to pause here. So in that climate of acceptance, for example, you know, in the last couple of weeks, I've been doing a lot of calling around the state. And my real question is this: I don't want to problem-size school resource officers, but I want to know, like, who's on duty, who's watching, and who's centralizing kind of the data collection of the involvement of school resource officers' activities they have? The answer is nobody. The answer is nobody. So the governor has expanded funding. There's legislation in PG County to increase, you know, school resource officers. And all of us are good with that. Why? Because school safety is one of our top 3 issues. But keep connecting the dots. We're drawing law enforcement circle around the kids that we really think it's okay to draw that circle around. I'll stop.
All right, thank you, Dr. Smith.
I don't know. You might have to keep it on.
Dr. Williams.
So, good afternoon, good evening rather. I am not clearing my voice because I want you all to look at me. I have a bit of a cold, so I'm going to try to get through this as articulately as I possibly can. So, all of my colleagues really laid out some really important considerations to the question of how we keep kids off of the school to prison pipeline. And I'm going to actually try to respond to the question a little bit of a different way, because I mean, outside of the scandals in Baltimore County, we actually do other things. So I'm going to talk about the other things we do. And one of the things that we have been doing for the past 5-6 years is really looking at the issue of racial equity. And so there's a natural intersection between racial equity work and really thinking very deeply about the school to prison pipeline. But it is important for us to understand how that pipeline gets constructed from birth to file up till kids graduate. So how many of you guys are parents? I'll show hands. Okay. I'm a new mommy. I have an 18-month-old, right? And so, exactly, right, I'm tired. And so he is teaching me something every day. And one of the most powerful lessons that he is teaching me is that I adjudicate if his behavior is acceptable or unacceptable. I adjudicate if what he is doing is problematic or if it's developmental. You know, I push the alarm as to when we need to go see the doctor. Like that is all being socially constructed by me, right? That's the exact same thing that happens in schools. And so the way that the pipeline gets constructed is about decisions that adults make about student behavior. And the unfortunate part of that decision-making process is that it is often done without the backdrop of a dogmatic norm about how kids are supposed to behave. Oftentimes, it is completely devoid of the developmental process that kids go through, right? And so now we're calling fights second-degree assaults. We're calling kids being in the hallway loitering, right? I mean, these are behaviors that developmentally, do we want to see kids in fighting? Of course not. But it is not out of the realm of the norm that kids will have disagreements and will do things like that. Now, when 40-year-old people are fighting, we can have a different conversation. But, you know, we're oftentimes talking about a second grader giving another one a hug or a kiss. And now we're talking about sexual assault. This is how crazy it's getting, right? And so part of the challenge, of course, is the question of, you know, how do we create safe environments? How do we grow our kids into the behaviors that we want them to engage in without the resort to problematizing kids? Because the deal is, any kid can be vulnerable to the school-to-prison pipeline, but all kids don't recover from it the same way, right? So the margin of error, if you're in certain bodies, is like slim to none. And so while it is, you know, all kids misbehave, we see all of these differences in what the outcomes are for them. So let me just talk really briefly about what the pipeline looks like according to the data. And Texas did a study of these data. They looked at a broad swath of students, they looked at suspensions, and they looked at entry into the prison system. It was a number of years ago. And I'm going to be nondescript and precise, but I'm going to sort of talk about it at a high level. So the first thing that happens is not in this report that I'm alluding to. I'll make sure you guys get the citation. When you go into a pre-kindergarten class or a kindergarten class, what teachers tend to spend a lot of time doing with kids is mat time, right? Everybody get on the mat and listen to a story, right? When little Bobby can't attend and he's fidgeting, he gets excluded from the mat. That's the first step. So when you walk into an early learning center and you see that there are certain students who are not with the group, who are excluded, who are however we are starting to exclude, that is how it starts. Then the next thing that happens, and Dr. Smith, you're right, the third grade indicator is 1, right? So when kids are not reading by grade 2, that's the next part. Because what happens after the third grade is the curriculum completely shifts. So we spend time in the public schools from K to 3 teaching kids the skills to learn to read. After that, the assumption is they know how to read, and we shift completely to reading to learn. So think about what kids do in school. They read in every class. They're reading in math class. So if I cannot read, what else am I going to do? Right? So then that triggers the next thing. Anybody know what the next thing is? Special education identification. Right? So now we're looking at this kid, and here's the thing. I've advocated with a number of parents with children in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and they see their kids not progressing, but oftentimes the response of the school system is less than adequate in addressing their concerns. If kids are not able to read, you raise hell until they can. Because after the third grade, the ability to sort of get on track, it only gets harder after that. So special education referral. Then kids end up in exclusive programs, right? So they now might be in self-contained programs with kids who are demonstrating what? Other behavioral issues, right? Like that's the best thing. So let me learn how to ramp it up. By middle school, they have maybe their first or second suspension. And by high school, we're talking about alternative placement. Those are the kids who are going to be most vulnerable to end up in the judicial system. And so part of what I would submit, what do we do to interrupt? We have to interrupt the system that does not include all students. If kids are not successful in school, if they're not bonded, if they're not attached, then they will act out, plain and simple. And the more suspensions that they experience, they just get bonded to things outside of school, which makes them that much more vulnerable to engaging in behaviors that are going to lead them down a path that they cannot recover from. And so engagement is critically important. There is a direct connection between teaching and learning and this pipeline. And so one of the things that I want to say, because I think this is really important, and it relates to why our students of color are so vulnerable to this pipeline. When we developed the system of public education, we did not do it with the kids that we are serving in our thought pattern. They were not, and unless you all know of some special period in time when we stopped and hit the reset and said, oh, our schools are really diverse. Let's change our practices, processes, and procedures to meet the needs of all kids. No, we didn't do that, right? And here, as I sit as a black mom, I am not masquerading as a white woman with brown paint on my skin. Like, my race, my gender, all of that has significant implications for how I see the world and how I parent. So I'm getting a 1 minute sign. I'm gonna give you one concrete example of how we get to like problematize students, and then begin to make decisions that put them on a pathway that is less than what we would want our children on. I heard a woman giving testimony at the meeting where we're having conversations about permanent superintendent, and she said her children matriculated through Baltimore County. She had one child who was identified as mentally retarded. By the time the kid was in the first grade, they gave him a cognitive battery. And they said to her, he doesn't know the word hell. And she said, because we call it a bucket at home. Culturally responsive instruction, cultural competency is critically important, not only in the delivery of instruction, but it is also critically important as to how we will assess behaviors that students are demonstrating. And because we are moving people into teaching and leading and managing without a full grasp of their own culture and background, their own race and identity, the way that they are judging students is oftentimes overly harsh, and the data tell the tale about who gets problematized. So those are my statements.
Thank you.
So who's got questions? If you got questions.
Questions?
Paula Whitaker, I apologize if I pronounced your name incorrectly, wants to know what are the educational requirements of a student resource officer and how much of that training is in the field of sociology.
None of the training is in the field of sociology. The only requirement is that they are a police officer.
Oh.
I don't know if they even have to be active. And for example, I live in Baltimore County. So if you go to the website for the school resource officers for Baltimore County Public Schools, it's actually maintained by the police department, which reports the data. And as a statistician myself, I'm always questioning data. So they report the level of involvement of SROs in the county. But the point is, at the end of the day, when, they are required to report into the precinct and not the principal. So it really is localized in the school, but they are not school employees, to my understanding.
And then another question, also to Dr. Smith, what were the demographics of the students arrested that you referred to in our schools?
Well, that's interesting. I do have those. Oh. Now, the interesting thing is, this is how we craft a story. So on the one hand, the system will release data, not at every school level, but generally speaking, they'll release school level data. But then they won't necessarily articulate it for across each of these demographics, but I do have this. So I don't have it by school, I just have it overall for all the high schools in Harford County. There were a total of, for African American males, 18 arrests that were based on assaults. And for white males, there were 17. Females, none. However, for controlled substances, none were associated with African American males. All of them were white males in here. So, and then, and I don't have it on this table, but the three African American males are arrested, generally speaking, across the state at the highest rate, and then those in special education. So as Dr. Williams said, once a student gets identified as special ed, they're problematized in so many ways. And to my understanding, it is very difficult for that child to be sort of mainstreamed back into the classroom, devoid of the stigma of being special ed and our lowered expectations of what that child can and cannot achieve.
And that's, that actually feeds right into this next question. This is directed to Dr. Williams. How do special needs kids factor into this situation? Do they have a higher rate of incarceration?
Yeah, so the most vulnerable students are the ones, from the perspective of the school system, the ones that experience suspension at the highest rates, right? And so if you look at data nationally, there are typically certain variables you will see. Well, first, we tend to talk about males, but black girls tend to be the highest suspended group of students when you compare them to other girls of different demographics. So that I want to put that out there because the lens of intersectionality is really important to understand how systems function to either support or make vulnerable different groups of students. And if we have more time, we can talk about that in a different way. But some of the intersections that you see in national data trends, there are certain things. Special education identification, poverty. We tend to talk about males because their numbers of suspensions are higher, but African American girls have a higher rate of suspension. You appreciate the difference, right? Okay. And so those are the factors that you should really be looking at in your school. What is the percentage of poor kids, percentage of kids of color? How does gender factor into that? And typically speaking, special education identification will make you more vulnerable. Now, why is that? Because there is a huge intersection with how kids get into special education, particularly as you look at race, by behavior. So often when we go into programs where kids are considered emotionally disturbed, you guys have those programs, behavior support, they call them BLS, places where kids tend to be in separate day schools, those kinds of things. When you look at the data of those students, they have generally high cognitive ability. So the question is, why are you in an emotionally disturbed behavior? Because of your behavior. So there's an intersection between special education and behavior, which is why those kids are more vulnerable to this pipeline.
Thank you. We had a speaker address teen court and community conference programs. Just a question, if you have the data, how effective are those teen court and community conference programs?
Well, I don't have the data in front of me, but looking through just from preliminary research that we do show that restorative justice approaches using teen court and the community conferencing has shown to be effective. I can get those numbers and definitely report back on those exact numbers, but I do know that it does work. It does, if you do it correctly and properly, that it does make a difference, especially with young people when it comes to restorative justice.
And this, any panelist can answer this question. In addition to teen court and community conferencing, we have someone that wants to know if there's any other resources that can prevent delinquency from the school to prison pipeline, and that's open for any panelists that should answer.
So I'll jump in. And I'll actually start from what the trend is pretty stable across school districts across the country. So this is the offense for which kids are most often suspended for. Does anybody want to venture a guess? Nope. Disrespect and insubordination. The idea of disrespect has a social context to it. For some kids, you step on my shoe, that's disrespectful. For teachers, if you're not sitting straight and you're listening and looking at me in my eye when I'm talking, that's disrespectful, right? So what am I suggesting? I am suggesting that a huge part of what is driving this is that we're not doing the kind of systemic transformation that really puts kids in a very honest way in the fullness of their development, cognitively, socially, and emotionally. We're not putting that at the center of our decision making. Because when kids are doing things that we would rather them not do, we're clear, the literature is very clear. punishment doesn't work. If the death penalty worked, nobody would kill anybody, right? Like that wouldn't be a thing. But that's not the relationship between the use of the death penalty and then people committing those kinds of crimes. And we know that in education too. The punishment doesn't work. But we had this notion that parents are supposed to teach their kids right? Well, parents are teaching their kids in ways that are relevant in their lives, which might not be the same expectation that we have in the schoolhouse. So there has to be some on-purpose work around creating an environment that observes who students are, who communities are, who families are, that doesn't problematize how folks show up. And if kids are showing up in a certain way, if they are behaving in a certain way, we understand that as an opportunity to teach new and different behaviors. The same way we would expect people to teach the math curriculum, the same way we would expect teachers to teach students to read, we also need to make space to teach students how to behave.
Yes.
I just wanted to add that, how many of you have ever heard the term generational competence? Yeah, I never heard that word. Look out for it because it's coming. Because we live in a different generation. And many times educators teach their children the way they were taught. And most times it was like maybe 10, 15 years ago, you know? So we have to develop, along with that cultural competence, generational competence as well, to understand this is the culture of our students today. And understanding that the way they communicate is a lot different than the way we communicate, specifically with adults.
So next question, this is directed to Dr. Smith. You mentioned an indirect pipeline versus a direct pipeline. Can you explain that and provide some clarification on that?
Right. So when we think, at least intuitively, when we think of the school to prison pipeline, we think largely of arrests and incarcerations, those types of things. But what we don't think about is student achievement, because we don't think of the ways in which, if a student does not meet certain developmental markers, certain benchmarks academically, how it puts them at risk of misbehavior, how it puts them at risk of school suspensions and some other forms of school discipline, how it puts them at risk of not being able to get in college. You see, so those things that we take for granted that the school is doing for other people's children, really, in certain schools, it creates structural inequalities for certain populations of students. They become much more vulnerable to how the school operates, how the school is resourced, how the community is policed. So I teach at Loyola University, and I've been participating in a number of discussions with the city around. They want to move in this direction of, the point of this is structural inequality. So they want to move in the direction of putting up smart street lights in the York Road corridor. What a smart street light is you put this little module on there that can do all kinds of things. It could, a shot detector, a gunshot goes off, and then there's a camera that's in it, it can point towards it. It could sense environmental hazards, things like that. But really what they're most interested in is the shot spotter technology.
Yes.
So I said, they said the community wants this. And I said, oh, no, that's not true. You see, because the west side of York Road is all white and privileged. What we really are concerned about is the east side of York Road where the black folks live. So here's the thing, this is how we kind of become complicit. You know, we all think, we want greater safety, this is a good thing, they equip police so they can respond faster. To whom? Mm-hmm. So these kids, when they're in school and when they're out of school, have that much margin for error to be a kid, as Dr. Williams said. I can tell you right now, I sat on the board on discipline at Loyola for 15 years. And those privileged white kids are as equally disposed to the same misbehaviors as the children that we see is really the problem threatening our safety. But you know they have that the other children don't have. First of all, they have our assumption that they really didn't need it. They're really good kids. They have misbehaved. The second thing they have is they have social capital. I can't tell you how many parents show, it's illegal, they can't do it, how many parents show up with a battery of lawyers when their child is threatened to be suspended from school, to keep them suspended. Now, who is showing up? In fact, in preparation for this, I read the American Bar Association that wrote a preliminary report on the school-to-prison pipeline in 2016. Being the American Bar Association, they recommend perhaps all children should have access to a lawyer. I get the spirit of what they're saying. Because given that the resources of the students on campus versus the students for whom we have literally just built a wall. We built a wall, and does it go all the way around campus? No, it goes on the York Road side. So essentially the wall is a symbol to keep the black kids out, which now, let's be very clear, if you're an African-American male student of Loyola, how do the police know? You black, and you've already been suspect. So just walk into the library now, your margin for error is like this. You're that far from central booking.
That's okay.
I mean,
We have one more question to the panelists, and then a couple that are just going to be asked to the audience just for consideration, thought, and something that we may take to our own school system. How big is the Cultural Diversity and Equity Department in Baltimore County Public Schools? Specifically, how many people do you have on their staff right now?
That's a good question. One of them is here. Hi, y'all.
Showing the support.
So we have 4 specialists. We have 2 support personnel, and we have 3 contractors, and then there's my position, executive directors. And just to give you a little bit of background about what it is that we do, and I'll talk mainly about schools since we're interested in the school-to-prison pipeline. Every school has an equity team. The equity team is comprised of the principal, the assistant principal, teacher leaders, and a position called the equity liaison. We send them through a battery of training for 3 years. And part of that training is about, number 1, recognizing that you have a race. Everybody has a race. And how that racial identity influences how you see, how you decide, right? And then ultimately, looking at your data and figuring out what you need to interrupt to bring about equitable access in your building. And so it could be that you're looking at your use of suspensions. It could be that you're looking at AP participation in advanced academics or GT. I know people call it different things. It could be that you're looking at special education. Students are supposed to exit special education. You guys know that, right? They're not supposed to stay there for their whole, they're supposed to actually return most of the, that's another conversation for another day too. And here's the deal, not to get off on this discussion, but if you look at the national data trends, white and Asian students get identified early and they get returned to general education. Black and brown students get identified and they never come back to general ed. They actually get into more and more restrictive environments as they go up. There's an intersection between that practice and this conversation about the school-to-prison pipeline. And so part of what that equity team is responsible for doing in the schoolhouse is to look at the system. The system is what they do in teaching and learning, right? So there's a system from the time your bell rings and the kids come in, from the bus ride to the bus ride home. And so how do we interrogate that system through the lens of equity to figure out what we need to interrupt, what we need to enhance? And I can tell you that so much of it is about changing our minds, is to recognize that we are making consequential decisions and then make different decisions.
Thank you to the panelists. Those are all the questions that we are going to ask the panelists. If your question was not asked, again, we will either contact you or we will make sure that question is addressed and put it out on, and make sure we can get that to you. There's a couple questions that were asked that pertain specifically to Harford County, and while the panelists may not be directly affiliated with Harford County Public Schools, these are just questions that we're going to acknowledge that were submitted for the audience to consider and potentially take to our local school system. The first one is what diversity training is currently being offered to Harford County teachers. So that's one that can be addressed with the board or a school official. Another question is, how can a citizen find out if their school is using methods or programs that will ensure students stay out of the prison system? And again, that's a question that would be good.
The board is here now? Board members are here?
We do have board members here. I'm not going to put them on the spot. If you don't want to answer now, that's okay. If you do, you certainly can. But these are questions that you'll likely hear from us soon. Another question that pertains specifically to Harford County Schools is, are the resource officers in Harford County Public Schools divided equally in terms of the number of resource officers that are in each high school? So those are just questions that were, again, asked more specifically to Harford County. Thank you again to the panelists. I'm going to turn it back over to Chris so we can go on to the small groups.
Thank you, Christian. Excellent job. By the way, I don't know if you mentioned, Christian is a 10th grader.
10th grader.
At C. Milton Wright. 10th grader. Okay, at this point, we are going to split into our 3 small group sessions.
Was recruited in 1982 by Harford County Public Schools to come as a minority educator in Harford County 36 years ago. My intent was to come here a year and go right back to Philadelphia, then 2 years, and here I am 36 years later, looking and waiting for to retire. I am pleased to be working for the Harford County Public School System. I think as a minority and as an African American male, they've been good to me. And it's done well by me and done a lot of great things for me. And so therefore, sometimes I often fear when I look at suspension and look at policies and procedures, my fear is what's going to happen to, I would say not only my African-American students, but students who are at risk. Because we're finding that a lot of students who are just at risk are falling into the same category. And we not understanding, somebody made a thing about generational competence. And I think that's the key that's going to save a lot of us. So not only can to join the Bernie on these in a few seconds, we have two of my friends and former colleagues to also to refer to if you have any questions. And a student representative, Ms. Nancy Reynolds and Mr. Bass Russell.
I'm Ryan Burby. I'm currently the president of the Harford County Education Association. I taught my whole career in both Harford schools. I started at Westport, the school ever to be reconstituted by the state of Maryland. I taught at Samuel F. Morris Elementary in West Baltimore, which is basically where The Wire was filmed, the Bay Ridge section of Baltimore. My current teaching position when I return to the classroom next year will be at Aberdeen Middle School. I taught there 6 years previously. Actually, before my first day, when I came for my interview, I met Jimmy because he was the vice principal there. I can tell you that all the things that Dr. Smith talked about, people selecting their neighborhood, I pretty much did the exact opposite. It was somewhat driven by my salary, but I also I decided I wanted to live in a diverse neighborhood. I decided I wanted to live where I teach. I've stayed there. I think that's an important priority and something you should advocate for is your public servants living where they work, or at least in the county. And to do that, there's a lot of things that take place. We've seen a lot of at-risk kids in Aberdeen, and the school to prison pipeline is no real mystery. A lot of kids come and go, and they have hard lives. And changing that. And Harford County Public Schools has generally been good to me. I enjoy working where I work. I enjoy working with the kids I work with. I've enjoyed my time as president, and you know, the seeds of change are starting to grow, and that's good to see. So I don't want to take that time to monopolize. I think Mr. Fulton can kind of give you an overview of suspension policies in HCPS, what that looks like, and first we can address your concerns.
What that comes to my mind is why suspend? Why do we suspend kids? And what is your answer?
I would say to preserve the experience of their classmates.
And what does that look like?
That looks like if you have one student who is causing disruption to the whole class, or even just a significant number, you remove one student so that presumably the rest will get another experience.
So maybe if I can parrot and jump in and address some perhaps misconceptions as we go along. When you suspend kids, it doesn't stop the misbehavior. It actually amplifies it. So when the disruptor leaves, usually they're already behind, because that's part of the reason they're the disruptor. And then if not, you know, we're involved, both of us are in middle schools. So after they leave, guess what? They go home, and whether we give them work or not, let me tell you, Sean doesn't come back with work. Certainly not work done. He comes back with it, it might be undone.
So would you say there's a falsehood about suspension?
Yeah, it doesn't solve the problem in of itself.
Oh, go ahead and finish your
And so often we amplify the problem when we suspend kids. So in my classroom, thanks to one of my former students, unless they're assaulting another child or so disruptive that I can't teach at all, I'm trying not to refer them because they might end up suspended. I'm trying to keep them in my room, and some kids I've even said, it's not a problem, Donald. You can stay with me for the whole day. I'm sure your other teachers will appreciate that you can stay and work with me for the day, and I'm certified in all subject areas, so I'm elementary certified, so I can teach all subjects in 6th grade. You can stay. And that, in my experience, has more of a positive effect on behavior if you keep the children in class.
Immediately, I'm not being ignorant, but isn't there somewhere a policy written that says why we suspend students? What is the institutional reason for this? It must be codified somewhere.
Well, there's a co-owners have to have laws and stuff for.
So what is that? Do you know?
Well, there are different judges, there are different realms of suspension and policy and procedures in place for different actions. Okay?
I mean, do they have a reason?
Is that outcome? No.
Okay, they don't say because we're doing this for this, hoping for this outcome?
We hope to change. Suspension is, as somebody said, we hope to change behavior.
Okay.
That's it? The end goal. Go ahead.
Okay.
Wait, and I agree with some of what Mr. Burby said, but I have to disagree with other things. Suspension sometimes does change behavior. And you need to know that any discipline is progressive. You're not going to suspend a kid because one time he didn't sit in his seat correctly, or one time he cut a class, or something like that. It is progressive because the overview of the school, when I was principal for 10 years, is to keep all kids in school, to keep them in classes. I too played the same game many times where somebody wanted to get suspended and was doing everything they could to get suspended. So rather than buy into that, they stayed with me all day. And that changed a lot of behavior, really. Just putting up with me for 6 hours a day was more than a lot of kids could handle. And they decided that they would follow the rules. So keep in mind that suspension is not the first resort that we go to, but the very, very last. There are so many interventions in between, from the teacher in the classroom to the guidance counselor to the assistant principal to peers, mediation with peers, to the principal, to parent conferences. We go through, and Jimmy can tell you because he does it on a daily basis, we go through a whole realm of interventions to try to keep this kid in class. Unless it's an emergency that is so severe that you have to remove a child from the premises. But even that we don't like.
I tell students off the bat there are 3 things I don't tolerate in school: guns, weapons, and drugs, and total defiance and disrespect to the teacher.
What did you say the lesson?
Total disrespect and defiance to the teacher. Those are my givens.
So when I first started teaching, 17, 18, 19 years, around 20, so I'm not sure exactly count, there was a specific level 1, level 2, level 3, and there was very harsh consequences with each level. And that was efficient, all right? Administrators knew what they were going to do, they came in, teachers knew what they were going to get, blah, 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 blah. Not so great when it comes down to, well, what were the extenuating circumstances and what are the real world circumstances? So we have a much more broad, individualized area. But again, that leaves a lot of room for interpretation. What is utter disrespect to the teacher? And some teachers think it's this, and some teachers think it's that. And so I once had a rule that if you dropped the F-bomb in the classroom, you were out. That's it. And then I had a child who every other day he would drop the F-bomb just so I kick him out of the classroom, and he would get suspended and just be this whole rigmarole. I just told him, I'm not letting you out. You know.
So I have 2 questions, one for each of you. In 36 years, has discipline and suspension policies changed?
They leveled.
Okay.
I would say change. We're supposed to have some of the same policy in place. They somewhat remain the same. They have the same policies, the same things, and people are becoming more understanding, okay, of the consequences.
When you say people, you mean students, teachers?
Teachers.
Parents?
Administrators, teachers. One thing we often think, and I don't like to discipline anything, we thought, here's an action, here's a discipline. The consequence is suspension.
So I wanted to piggyback on a question that seems really basic that this gentleman asked a little bit ago. Is there a list of activities in some policy book that says if you I'm making this up, come to school naked, drive your car into the building, these things you are going to be suspended. That everyone can say, yes, she's naked.
We have a list of activities such as class cutting, tardiness, truancy, alcohol, inhalers, drugs, tobacco, firearms, other guns, other weapons, physical attack on students, physical attack on staff, fighting, extortion, arson, false alarms, explosives, sexual assault, sexual harassment, sexual activity, disrespect, insubordination, harassment, classroom disruption, inciting disturbance, academic dishonesty, portable offense, theft, trespassing, unauthorized sale, distribution, vandalism, refusal to disobey policy, and non-dress.
Dr. Fulk, is that everybody's list?
It's
Do
the
all
whole
of
system, yes.
just the Harford County school system?
But it's still interpretive as to whether they're going to be suspended and for how long.
Yeah. And who decides if they're going to be, because some of those things are, someone would say, these are crimes versus this is inconvenient. So who just makes that determination? Who's making all these decisions about?
Unfortunately, fortunate and unfortunate, it's in the hands of administration and then superintendent if they're very severe. The administration handle. You have to deal with each situation by case situation. So
where does the student resource officer come in? Because there's some cases where
violence,
the student,
fight, assaults, physical assaults.
And that's up to the teacher to call for the SRO?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but my assumption is in Harford County schools, and what my experience has been, is that the school resource officers still somewhat operate under the direction of the principal. So while they don't work for the principal, we don't have school resource officers like you've seen in the videos, who jumping in classrooms and handcuffing kids and all that kind of craziness, okay? So on occasion they do take kids out.
especially in middle school, our last resort is put a child in handcuffs. That's the last.
I've never seen it happen.
So the resource officer's answer to the principal, not to like Dr. Smith was saying, in Baltimore County, it sounds like they
Well,
report to the
it's contractual under the police department. However, when they get to that place, they follow the rules of the school and the principal.
They're paid by the legal authorities, police department, sheriff's department, whatever it might be. That they work under the rules and regulations of the Board of Education.
So their boss is the police and their manager is the principal.
Can the principal ask them to leave if they're not, if something egregious
Yes.
happens, the principal asks them to leave?
They can ask them not to intervene, and to leave the building.
Okay.
The principal can ask anyone. I can attest to that.
Could I add something to that? So a police officer will, they can arrest somebody for a crime committed in their presence if they observe some specified crimes. But if they don't see it committed in their presence, you know, all those list of activities, they don't see those things happening. They don't have knowledge of it if an administrator brought it to their attention. If a police officer is physically in a room and somebody is fighting, that's why you see people taking action at that time, because they cannot sit back and watch two people in hand-to-hand combat and not take any action. That would be almost illegal for them to do.
Well, nor can your school employees. We are obligated under code
Right,
to
that's why
protect
we
children
scared
at
of
school.
sometimes. So whatever they don't see happening in their presence, only the administrator bring it to their attention, then they can take action only when asked to do so. But if a crime will be committed in their presence, there are some things where they have to act, not, something minor, only serious things like serious crimes.
I don't know of any of those occasions that have happened.
But
And
only
I
in their
still
presence.
think it's
Two kids
mediated
are
by
fighting in their
the
presence.
authority under the principal, whether there will be any arrests going on in the school. Now, I assume that an officer could push it to that
Well,
in
the
theory,
officer- the
but
officer
I haven't
would say-
seen it happen.
If there's a fight, is to the extent the officer can say, well, the school system is doing that, but we're going to charge. That can happen.
Yeah, and I do know of one occasion where a child wasn't escorted out, but then they were escorted out by school staff, but then met by sheriff's deputies outside the school. They were charged, even though the school was not really involved in the process overtly. They had done some crazy stuff.
Yeah, question.
I just wanted to touch on the what Mr. Reynolds had said about mediators from peers, and what Mr. Burby had said about individual situations with teachers perceiving things in different ways. When teachers might perceive something one way than another teacher, that's why we have all those different levels, and that's why we have all the peer mediation, and then we go through all the other people so that other people get get the insight of why that person might perceive it that way, and so that they have multiple opportunities before they get suspended, or before that's the last. That's really, like Ms. Reynolds had said, the last thing that we want to do is get someone outside of the school building.
I think you had another question.
Well, I had a secondary question for you. Since you've taught in other counties and other school systems, how similar are discipline and suspension policies?
When I taught 3 years in Baltimore City,
Okay.
and I taught in elementary school in West Baltimore. They don't have school resource officers. We got little babies walking through neighborhoods you guys don't even drive through. Generally speaking, we don't suspend, they didn't suspend kids except as a last resort. My principal, on occasion, when things got really unruly, would just drive kids home. All right, guys, get in my car. And she would take them home. It's extreme. There's nothing like that here. There's absolutely nothing like the level of poverty, the level of movement that is there.
But in some of those cases, do any of those children have advocates in like the child protective services or through the court systems if there's extenuating home circumstance?
There's lots, yeah. I mean, we had homeless kids, we had kids that were in child protective services. I mean, there's all levels of that. Generally speaking, the police get involved a lot less with elementary kids. And in the city, they get involved less with kids. At least a decade ago that I was there, more than a decade ago that I was there, and it's escalated over time.
Do we have in-school suspension programs in Harford County?
We do.
Is that what you were talking about? Because I wasn't sure, like, if someone was suspended, but they were in school and they stayed, like you said, with you, that's an in-school suspension?
We're getting away from the in-school suspension, we call them alternative educational environments. Okay. Alternative education.
It's not much fun to sit there.
Sit by themselves with administration.
So they're really refraining from the in-school suspensions.
So, in-school suspension, yes, they have it. It presents the same problem, right? If the kid's not in class, they're not learning what you're teaching them. I can't box up myself and ship myself off to in-school suspension and teach a kid how to write their essay. I can't give them feedback. You can't give them a science lesson in a room with 30 other kids or 20 other kids or however many, depending on the school they're on. Suspension in of itself, exclusion, has a negative side to it as well. That tends to proliferate the behaviors.
I just had a question about just stepping back and looking at the overall attitude to misbehavior, whether it falls under the inconvenience category. I mean, mostly for the ones that fall under, let's say, the inconvenience category. Because I'm thinking of what Dr. McNair said earlier about seeing somebody who is misbehaving as not being able to express themselves or responding to some other. I mean, that's a complete different attitude. I mean, today I had the opportunity, like my daughter was 5 minutes late. This is the first time she's ever been late. She's like this eager, ever-ready student, and I just saw the way she was treated for being 5 minutes late, and I thought, wow, I was really feeling bad when I left after signing her in today, and I thought, No, just this cold, I mean, nothing bad happened, but I just thought, just this sort of cold, bureaucratic, where were you? Sign this form. Like, even if with a smile they say, hey, you're late, you've got to sign the form, it would have been different, right? But just looking at this kind of cold response, so then what's going to happen for, repeat offenders or even more serious things?
If you felt uneasy and felt like you need to talk to an administrator, you should spoken to an administrator because we want everybody to come to a happy place. And sometimes
I would hope so.
Sometimes we may not, sometimes my stuff says step back a little bit. I tell students all the time, it's not about you right now. Let me chill. I just got finished. Somebody just cussed me out down the hall. And you're right now in my face asking me, can you go to the bathroom?
Right. So all the teachers might be. So all the teachers might be dealing with stuff like that, right?
It's a complicated situation.
Yeah.
Smart man to me, John Dewey, said schools should be community centers. And what that implies is, a logistical and community thing, but also it implies the role that the community in each individual plays. So it starts at home with what acceptable behavior in school is, acceptable consequences for behavior. It translates into school and what acceptable behavior is in each of the individual classrooms, what acceptable behavior is for the teachers and for the students, for administration. And all of these folks have varying viewpoints. And we haven't done a great job congealing these viewpoints. And so you said whether it's annoyance or not, my take on discipline is a proactive one. So if I'm having an issue with a child that is repetitive, I make sure that I contact parents. Oftentimes, I call them at work. That usually gets a response, at least after the second, third, fifth call. I send letters home. As a last resort, I'm looking to exclude the child from the classroom. Now that's something I learned and was taught to me in Baltimore City because they taught us you're giving the power away, right? If you want children or adults or anyone else to respect you, you don't send them to someone else to figure out what they did wrong.
Yeah.
My question is about an issue that I think it was Dr. Smith brought up about cultural competency, because I hear you, cultural competence, because I hear you use words like what's acceptable, what's disrespectful, parents should teach them how to do X, Y, and Z. So everything that has to happen, the parents and the kids have to figure it out. the comment that it was either Dr. Smith or someone else on the panel said, teachers also have to get some training in cultural competence so that they too, it's not just on the, I mean, and that's my concern as a community, that's my concern as a community member, that people are always saying, these kids, these parents, and in fact, the people who are doing the removal, the exclusion, aren't the parents or the kids. So what's the, I mean, there's a burden that teachers, administrators have to share, take on something.
And you're right, and there's that midway point where we're stuck in the middle.
I mean, I guess I'm wondering, I shouldn't be talking to you at this point, but I mean, I'm wondering, as community members, I'm just saying that the community has to have some expectations that we say to the board, the county council, who, you know, invests and says, here's how much money you can have for cultural competency training, that's needed. Because I'm guessing there are a lot of teachers who would say this is a great resource for us to have, but you all can't, you know, you're already spending your own money on everything else in the classroom.
So I'm going to say some things that probably as well as in Mr. Fuller can't really say.
You have 5 minutes.
We don't do a great job of cultural competency. Period. We're not doing a great job of that. And that's the whole
Even though we make sure every teacher is trained.
Every teacher does take one education is multicultural class somewhere. But we could do a much better job. Now, that cultural competency, and I'm the biggest advocate you'll ever meet for teachers. I'm their president. But I'm telling you that we are part of the problem. And getting folks to understand that is something that our our national affiliate, NEA, is taking on at great pain. And our state affiliate is trying to take on, and we too.
That's a big part of the problem. A third of the problem as well is hiring teachers and getting people to maintain, to stay in the county, people who do understand differences of all backgrounds. Because even though we do take that one course, you know, we can say we are in this course for, 3 weeks, 5 weeks, or 9 weeks. Are we practicing what we were taught? Are we understanding what we are taught? Or, you know, we have to understand that just because I'm over here doing this,